Climate Solutions webinar series. This series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. Serving as an advisory board, the Council is charged with looking at the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and recommend new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, you can go to www.ct.gov/DEEP/GC3. This webinar series explores innovative climate solutions in Connecticut and beyond, and the series provides firsthand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. If you missed one of our previous webinars, they are archived on our website, and I very much encourage you to visit the website to view them. Today, we're excited to have Cesar Serrano-Chassin from ICLEI, Carly Chavera from the World Resource Institute, and Nick Fremont from the Green Business Certification Incorporated. They'll be speaking about the recently launched City Planner Program. This capacity building program provides education and a rigorous certification program for urban greenhouse gas inventory specialists. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please submit your question in the dialogue box, and we'll read it aloud for our presenters to respond to. Before we get started, if you're having any trouble with your sound quality or you're listening via your computer speakers, I do encourage you to use a landline or a telephone. Sometimes it can be better on that. So with that, Cesar, Carly, and Nick, thank you so much for your willingness to present today. We're really excited to learn more about the City Climate Planner Program, and I'll now turn it over to you to get started.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So before we dive in, I thought I would just start to giving you guys a little bit of background about the program. The City Climate Planner Program was established by the World Bank Group in 2014 in partnership with the World Resources Institute, WRI, C40, and ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability through funding from the Korea Green Growth Trust Fund. And it's currently being administered through a partnership between my organization, Green Business Certification, Inc., ICLEI, and WRI. And the overarching goal of the program is to build capacity in cities to support local scale climate initiatives. The City Climate Planner Program aims to do this through training and a suite of professional credentials focused on helping practitioners develop the skills needed to design, plan, and implement green growth initiatives in their cities. And the program is intended to focus broadly on climate planning, but the first credential that we've launched is the Urban Greenhouse Gas Inventory Specialist, in part because standardized greenhouse gas emissions inventories are really the fundamental building blocks to support the development of quality climate action plans. And few cities have comprehensive climate action plans or green growth strategies that are based on reliable data. So, today we're hoping that through our presentation, you will understand the importance of city-scale greenhouse gas emissions inventories to city climate planning. You'll be able to describe how the greenhouse gas protocol for cities is different than other methodologies, and you'll understand the Urban Greenhouse Gas Inventory Specialist credential and the related training opportunity. And so with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Cesar to talk to you about the importance of the impact of cities when it comes to climate change. Cesar?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Hello, everybody. We are so happy to have you here. Thank you for attending. We hope that this short webinar will be very useful for you. So following up on the guidance from Nick, of course, I would like to introduce why do we consider that cities are such an important part in the fight against climate change. No, towards our goal from the -2 degrees, we have considered that cities, of course, are the main source of emissions due to the city-induced activities and the demand for materials and services. But why particularly cities? Cities have 5 points that we should highlight that are embedded within the urban context, within the geographical boundaries of the city. And those are energy intensive. Why cities are energy intensive? High population density high waste production, massive transportation needs, climatization, and so forth and so on. There are another couple of subsectors that are also included within the context of the GPC, how the GPC categorizes the emissions and allocates them towards the scopes, but in at a minor range. I'm going to particularly highlight these 5 points here and explain why you should consider these particular areas within the urban context for greenhouse gases emissions. Next slide, please. Nick, one more slide. Yeah, that one, yeah. So all of recent studies have demonstrated that cities consume around 80% of energy in the world, may vary between 65 to 85%, depending on the region and country. And of course, because of the energy grids are mixed, comes with several sources for energy generation, geothermal, nuclear, the use of diesel, coal, hydroelectrical projects, so forth and so on. We know that our energy not always is as clean as we want it to. And the demand for public lighting and the use within the households of both electricity for illumination and electrical appliances, as well as sometimes heating devices which use electricity, come high in the global north. This includes all of the countries in Europe, the United States, Canada, Russia. And we know that this case is not particularly replicated to cities within the tropics. In the south, we also may have this case as well. So energy is one of the two most representative sectors within the context of greenhouse emissions of the urban context. Next slide, please. What else? What else is correlated to this high demand of energy, the high intensity of energy? The population density. As we can see here with this data from 2012, 70% of human lives in cities. We can see here that the density of inhabitants per square kilometer adds a lot of demand for resources and services. For instance, we have Jakarta with 4,300 people per square kilometer, Mexico City with 9,500, Sao Paulo with a little bit over 6,000, Seoul with 10,000, Tokyo, and then Mumbai, which is one of the more highly populated cities in the world. This, of course, not all of the inhabitants which are within this square kilometer have this particular demand per capita, because some of them might be people without houses, homeless people, people with just are commuters, we come and work in the city and then leave. But it is within a scenario that the demand is created for the main triggers for greenhouse gases emissions at this point. No? Next slide, please. Aligning with this production of emissions due to the demand of energy, we have the high waste production per capita. Here we have a graphic that showcases the production of the municipal solid waste per capita in all of the RNC to work with where there is data existence here. You can see that in the global north as well, and some countries in the global south, the per capita generation of municipal solid waste production, solid waste mostly, it goes over 2.5 kilos. And this, of course, includes a lot of plastics, of organic waste, glass, and other materials, which, of course, have a high demand for during the production stage, but are not as demanding when they are disposed at the end. But we need to take into account that the disposal of organic waste, depending on the type of treatment that is created, will generate methane and nitrous oxide, as well as depending on the type of treatment for wastewater and sludge from wastewater, and also for industrial wastewater. And the highly industrialized the country is, the higher the production is. This, of course, is not normalized among all of the states, provinces of the particular country, but it takes a general context and a holistic overview. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, within the population density, we have seen that there are commuters here. And of course, within the context of a city, we have the high demand of transportation. As we can see here, most of the emissions from the transportation sector comes from the combustion of the fossil fuel. This takes into account cars, buses, trains, airplanes, boats, freight transportation. From this particular point of emissions, of course, from the whole, the bulk of emissions that we see here, only 15 to 30% is emitted by the oil production for the extraction and refining of the product. And of course, the emissions which are produced geographically are mostly by the combustion on site due to the demand of transportation. We need to take into account also that there is also demand for industrial purposes, for instance, the use of fossil fuel for plastics in the industry as well. But here we are taking into account the combustion to create transportation, to provide transportation to the inhabitants of the city, including commuting share. Next slide, please. As a final sector that we should take into account, there is the climatization and industry, of course, due to the increase of heating waves and the potential growth of the threat of climate change around the world. We will need, of course, more and more climatization, more particularly for cooling systems in the tropics, and at some point for heating processes in the global north during the harsh winters, which are getting colder and colder. No? Hence, the hydrofluorocarbon emissions are up to 54% with air conditioning. This is a case within the UK only, and of course, they're going to keep on increasing and increasing. The main issue is that there's still no proper treatment for this particular subsector of emissions. So the global warming potential is getting higher throughout the years. Should we take into account the different IPCC assessment reports, which of course comes with HFC, PFC, so forth and so on. So climatization and industry are a big chunk of emissions that should be considered within what is the city-induced activity for this particular subsector. Hence, all of these sectors that I had mentioned before are enclosed, and we have learned throughout our many years of experience that this is the particular subsector where the cities generate emissions at this point, and these are the sectors that you should tackle mainly for measuring your emissions with different methodologies which are available within the GBCI document. No? Now I'm going to show you what have we gathered within the collection of over 100 inventories in my organization, ICLEI. We have a platform that cities use to report, and within the context of the Global Covenant of Measures for Climate and Energy, we have reviewed over 100 inventories, which are GPC compliant, that fulfill all of the requirements of the Global Protocol for urban GHG emissions of this scope. No? So what are cities reporting? We can see here that in Asia, we have here this average here. As you can see, here are the scopes, which Carly will explain later on. We have the 5 sectors here. We have stationary energy, which includes buildings, and of course, all of the subsectors from buildings, industry, residential, commercial. For transportation, includes all of the subsectors, like I mentioned before, for airborne railways, on-road, off-road transportation, airborne transportation, waste, IPPU, which is industrial product and product uses, as well as AFOL, which is agriculture, forestry, and land use. What is the total of the Asian average? As we can see here, the Asian average have a high demand for scope 2 and stationary energy. What is scope 2? A little bit of let's say spoilers here before Carly presentation, is the emissions that coming from generated from demand from energy from the grid. That means 100% electricity. Scope 1 is of course the emissions of fossil fuel within the buildings or stationary energy. As you can see here, the highest demand is for electricity. And you will see how this gets modified within other regions. Next slide, please. Here we have Africa. As you can see, Africa as well, they have a higher demand for electricity, but not as high for combustion of fossil fuels within the stationary energy sector. For transportation, as you can see here in comparison previously to the Asian context, I don't know if you can go back one slide, Nick. Yeah, here you can see in scope 2 for transportation, there is a little bit of demand for electricity. That means that they have started the introduction of electric vehicles there. In Africa, one slide ahead, please. The next slide. In Africa, as you can see, this is not happening. So this reflects somehow what are the strategies that the regions, countries are taking. No? As you can see, the demand for electric vehicles here is absent in the African context. Within ways, we can see that pretty much all of the countries that we have reviewed prefer to treat their waste within the geographical boundary of the city. And as well, they have not that much emissions from industry and not that many from portfolio, although sometimes they can, of course, justify that they have lack of data for this particular sector or subsector. Next slide, please. For Latin America as well, now here we can see different representation. Latin America has a higher demand for combustion of energy within the stationary sector, and as well the demand for electricity on scope 2 is not that high. That doesn't mean that the volume is not high. The volume is indeed high because we do have a lot of people in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, so forth and so on. But we have a lot of hydroelectric power projects. Hence, the emission factor is not as high as in other countries. So the emissions are not as high. No? Our main issue is transportation. We need to mobilize a lot of people because we produce a lot of oil. Of course, we are very oil dependent, and we have a lot of issues with transportation. As well, we barely have introduction of electric vehicles here. You can see here clearly represented regarding waste. You can see here that scope 3 means waste treated outside the boundary of the city. We prefer to treat it outside of the city. And we have a lot of emissions from Afolo, particularly from Argentina regions, which produce a lot of meat within within this context. Next slide, please. Here, of course, we can see another average. If I'm not mistaken, this should be North America or Europe. This is Europe, and you can see here that Europe as well has a high demand for fossil fuels. Although there are some cities which are already experimenting with electric vehicles, those cities have not particularly reported a GBCI compliant inventory, hence they have not been included within this extraction and visualization. The demand of electric energy and fossil fuels on stationary energy is pretty roughly quite similar. And of course, we also see here that it reflects that the industrialization of these countries has allowed them to have a straight framework for reporting, so the emissions for IPPU sector are highly considered as well. Next slide, please. This is North America. In North America as well, the demand for electricity is very high. The demand for fossil fuels within the stationary energy sector, scope 1, is not as high. You have a high demand for fossil fuels. And one particular context is that the cities in North America, this includes the United States and Canada, have decided to report scope 3, which is the emissions of the commuters within the transport sector, the commuters that live outside the city but come to your city to work and then leave. Most of North American cities have decided to report this. This is a very particular subsector to report, as it's quite complicated to do so. No? Next slide, please. And finally, we have a comparability scenario here. As you can see, we have several regions and the scopes and subsectors, as you can see here, how they compare to each other, and what is the trend of the report that we are seeing at this point. No? What is important to mention here is that this is not particularly representative, because although we have over 100 inventories which are compliant with the GBCI, not all of the regions have the same number of inventories. Some regions have only 11 inventories, some regions have 6, some regions have 8. And although this shows what is the trend, we cannot call it a particularly representative sample until we have the same number of inventories per region under the same conditions. But we can see where the trend is growing. As you could see, all of the sectors and subsectors which I mentioned during my introduction were included here, and we are considering that vendors are becoming more and more complete in order to do this type of evaluations and cross-checking at an international level to consolidate data for data aggregation at horizontal level for cities, counties, and states around the whole world. And that'll be the next slide. So, what is the importance of the role? Of course, the city ability to take effective action. Why? Because most of the time cities can move faster, they have more liberty to work with their own budgets, they can monitor projects faster, and of course they have access to first-hand data to develop the inventory. They can plan for the climate actions, which of course starts with the GC inventory. They can have their own baseline, which cannot be directly aligned with the national context. And of course, this type of inventories allow cities to determine where to best direct the mitigation efforts. For instance, in transport, but where in transport? Fossil fuel, or should we start to introduce electric vehicles to create a policy for electric vehicles, incentives, market, create a market for electric vehicles, so forth and so on, of course. No? And cities use these inventories to set emission reduction targets along with other tools and to form the climate action plans and track their performance progressively and towards their goal, and of course comparing all of the same sectors and subsectors to have a consolidated approach. Next slide, please. So in addition to the inventory, of course, cities can meet legal and voluntary requirements. For instance, if you are aligned to an international initiative, and furthermore, it's a requirement for city project funders should you want to show your commitment towards a goal and how well aligned you are to international principles and initiatives, which of course will portray your city in a quite positive light in the eyes of financial resources. Next slide, please. What is the good advantage of this? If all cities start using the same method of course, it's easier to measure. But if the cities start to use different methodologies, it will be very difficult to aggregate. So hence we support and leverage all of the cities that want to start to report using the GBCI. So emissions and sources are defined and categorized different depending on the methodology, and of course different according to the treatment. So the comparison on how it progresses according to the type of treatment that you do to the city, how you gather the data, it gets more and more complicated depending on various international standards. For instance, France has the bilan carbon, the Japanese have their own standard. In Europe, they use the baseline and monitoring emission standard. So each regions have developed their own standard, and most of the time they don't use their own, they use the IPCC standard, which does not reflect particularly very well how a city behaves. So to allow more credible reporting and meaningful benchmarking and aggregation, of course, we require a greater consistency in the GHG accounting process. So we need something to respond to this challenge. We offer framework, we reflect clearly how the city behaves and what are the main sectors, subsectors for city. With of course builds on existing methodologies. We borrow from different methodologies, and we of course have superseded these methodologies which are in existence now. Hence why we consider that the GBCI is the most robust methodology in existence for global measuring at urban level. Next slide, please. Yep, that's it for me. Then I will leave Carly to follow up with the GBCI.
Great, thank you. Right, so I'm Carly, and one moment. And so now, based on what we just heard from Cesar on the importance of city inventories, I'm going to take you through a brief introduction of the Global Protocol Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventories, or as we've been saying, GPC for short. So next slide. So just a brief, intro about the GPC. What is it? Essentially, it's a document, and, as Cesar highlighted, it's a standard to follow when, your community is creating an inventory. The reason we're talking about it now is because it's the basis for the City Climate Planner Greenhouse Gas Inventory Specialist credential. And the reason that this is used is it goes back to what Cesar was saying about harmonization. Because previously methods to create inventories were inconsistent, didn't allow for comparison, the GPC really filled that hole and was set as the global standard to use for creating inventories to allow for consistent reporting and comparison. So next slide. So now I'm going to pivot and do a brief introduction to some of the reporting requirements of the GPC before going into potential applications for your inventory and finishing off with some training opportunities. So reporting framework. The GPC requires cities to report their emissions by gas, scope, as we had talked a little bit about, sector, subsector, and then to add up these emissions using two distinct but complementary approaches. So on the left here, you see the scopes framework. And so this totals all emissions by their scope, 1, 2, and 3. So 1 being the territorial emissions within the boundary of the city. Scope 2 being grid supplied energy, so electricity. And the third being any emissions that happen outside of the city, but are attributable to city activities. So, airplane flights to come to the city for conferences or other economic activity happening. On the right-hand side, you see the city-induced framework, and so this totals greenhouse gas emissions attributable to activities taking place within the geographic boundary of the city, and it covers select economic sectors within scope 1, 2, and 3 that are really popular across all cities. So we're talking about stationary energy, transportation, and waste. And for calculating these sectors, there's generally standardized methods available. So next slide. And here gives an overview of the required reporting information on your inventory. So when you go about doing an inventory, it's required or recommended that you specify the reporting level that you're using. So for the basic, I've highlighted the requirements here in blue. So with your inventory, it's required to report what greenhouse gases you're including as part of your calculations, with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide being required for a basic level reporting. It's also recommended that you report on the global warming potentials information used, and there's more guidance in the GPC to go about this, as well as how to report on the overall methodology used for creating your inventory. And finally, the emission sources, as I just highlighted, stationary energy, transportation, and waste being required for basic, but additional information on industrial processes, agricultural, forestry, and other uses available in the GPC. So next slide. Another concept that you'll learn in your training as part of the credential is this notation keys. So the GPC takes into account the fact that data completeness, quality, availability varies from city to city. And so in order to still, encourage greenhouse gas inventory reporting and, recognizing for that variance, there's a standard of notation keys to be used. So where information's not available or there's some discrepancies, it's important to use these standardized reporting keys and giving a brief justification on why that information wasn't estimated or wasn't occurring. And of course, there's training available on this, just something to keep in mind when you're going about doing your inventory. Next slide. So now I'll get into those three sectors that we were discussing earlier. So you saw the global reporting and distribution, but I just wanted to go over here what are we including when we define stationary energy. So the stationary energy sources, they're one of the largest for cities' greenhouse gas emissions, as we saw, and these come from the combustion of fuel in residential, commercial, institutional buildings and facilities and manufacturing industries and construction, as well as power plants to generate grid-supplied energy. This sector also includes fugitive emissions from fossil fuels, extraction, transformation, transportation, those activities. Next slide, please. So next we have the transportation sector. And so this is defined by all journeys by road, rail, water, and air, including intercity and international travel. So greenhouse gas emissions are produced by the direct combustion of fuel or indirectly by use of grid-supplied electricity for electric vehicles. And it's recognized that collecting data for this sector is sometimes difficult. And so there's a lot of guidance available on calculation methodologies, allowing for some flexibility here for the inventory purposes. Next slide, please. And thirdly, we have the waste sector. And so waste disposal and treatment produces emissions through aerobic or anaerobic decomposition or incineration. And emissions from solid waste should be calculated by the disposal route, typically landfill, or biological treatment and incineration and open burning. And there's some specifics here. So if methane is recovered or other types of energy recovered, then those are to be reported under stationary energy, for instance. And again, there's guidelines and training available on calculating emissions in this sector as well. There's some different options there. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to pivot to applications of your inventory and how it ties into your city's broader climate plans and climate action goals. So if your city has a goal or is thinking of setting a goal, it's important to keep in mind that developing inventories, setting goals, and tracking the progress of those goals are all part of this interconnected process where setting a mitigation goal can help cities focus on the key efforts that you uncover in your inventories, and that can lead to innovative mitigation solutions and reduction of costs over the long term, especially if you set a long-term multi-year goal, and can also help demonstrate leadership in the city climate field. Now, if you haven't yet set your goal as a city, it's important to keep in mind that there's generally 4 different types of goals to consider. So whether you want to consider your reduced emissions to a base year of emissions, or the intensity of emissions during a base year, compared to population or GDP, or a baseline scenario of projected emissions and how your goal trajectory compares, or a fixed level goal such as a carbon neutrality target or a peaking target. So there's more information again here in the GBC to consider what types of goals, and to keep in mind that your goal and your inventory should be related there. You should be using one for the other. So next slide. The other aspect of this obviously is tracking your emissions over time. So it's an important Tracking emissions is an important component of the inventory because, it provides information on the historical emissions trends, and which are important to know as far as goal setting. It also can help track the effects of policies or climate action policies enacted by your city. So were they effective in bringing, reducing emissions, and are you on the right track to reach your goal? So technically, to keep in mind when you're tracking your emissions, it's important to keep in mind that emissions over time should be estimated consistently. So that means using similar methods, data sources, your same definition of what your city boundary is, and keeping those really consistent over time as to be able to compare. Next slide, please. And so, as I've been saying, there's a lot of training opportunities available here. At the cityclimateplanner.org, on the resources page, you'll find a lot of research and technical guidance, as well as databases for emission factors and data sources. There's guidebooks and tools for specific sector calculations, and there's also broader e-learning resources. So that's all I have. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nick to speak more specifically about the City Climate Planner program and the credential.
Thanks, Carly. So after all of that great technical information that you guys just heard about the need for cities to act and about the GPC as a tool to accurately measure greenhouse gas emissions, I'm going to wrap things up with a topic that may seem like a bit of a drag for some people, but which we at GBCI are really excited about, and that is credentialing. I think maybe a lot of people here are familiar with credentials. There's a lot of different names used: badge, registration, licensure, accreditation, diploma, degree. And so, a lot of these terms are used in different ways by different people, and they all have different meanings. For example, licensure is a mandatory process by which a government agency grants time-limited permission to an individual to engage in a specific occupation after verifying that they've met a certain criteria, and it offers title protection for those people. So, licensure would apply to a licensed architect or a doctor or a profession like that. And accreditation, on the other hand, is a voluntary process by which a non-governmental agency grants time-limited recognition to an institution, organization, business, or other entity after verifying that that it has met predetermined criteria. And so, what is personnel certification? Along these same lines, it's a process through which a non-governmental entity, in this case, it's the secretariat formed by the partnership of our organizations, grants a time-limited recognition, and that time-limited recognition is so important because that's what really ensures that people are staying up to date with the current knowledge and skills that are needed in an evolving industry. So grants a time-limited recognition to an individual after verifying that she or he has met established criteria for proficiency or competency, usually through an eligibility application and an assessment. And that assessment can vary pretty dramatically based on the profession. Could be an exam, a review of the portfolio of a person's work, or even having a person carry out an activity in a controlled setting. Like if you think of like a driving test where you are monitored by an examiner who watches you perform the activity. And so what is the point of all of this? The point of certifications, generally speaking, is to instill public confidence and trust. Confidence and trust that they've been verified by an organization to ensure that a person has a specific and standardized set of knowledge and skills. Why get certified? There's a lot of reasons that a person might be interested in getting certified to verify their knowledge to potential employers, to help further their career or reach new opportunities for advancement with an existing employer, and just generally to distinguish themselves from their peers, or also to join a network of like-minded peers with similar knowledge so that they can to network and coordinate and help build each other's knowledge. So with that in mind, I would like to speak to you a bit about our first credential offered as part of the City Climate Planner program, which is the Urban Greenhouse Gas Inventory Specialist. It was developed by a committee of practitioners, including greenhouse gas inventory consultants, city officials, and educators from all around the world, and is designed to verify a practitioner's knowledge and ability to implement the GPC protocol for greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And so just to give some specific information about, about this credential, I mentioned eligibility requirements before are an important part of any personnel certification. They help to define who the certification is intended for, as well as what the minimum level of competency a person needs to be likely to be able to pass the exam. So, you know, to be eligible to apply for the exam, you first submit an eligibility application, and because this credential is really meant to be an industry-leading credential for established practitioners to verify that they really have the competence to complete this task, there's a requirement for practical experience, which is work performed in a job setting of developing all phases of a greenhouse gas inventory. It doesn't necessarily have to be a GPC compliant inventory, but just having completed a greenhouse gas inventory, as well as also having either a degree in higher education or 5 years working in the field. Once a person is found eligible, they can then sit for the exam. Our assessment is a computer-based 100-question multiple choice exam, which is offered through Prometric test centers from all around the world. And so I'll just go through here. These are the knowledge areas for the exam. It's the things that people have to know about and what the exam covers, and all of these are within the context of the GPC protocol, or as defined by that protocol. So that is really the reference and source material that you would study to pass the exam. And so the first part is project planning, and that includes establishing the goals and objectives, developing a plan, and establishing your quality control procedures. The next knowledge area is defining the scope, which involves identifying program authorities, defining the objectives, determining the reporting framework or platform. You know, Carly gave you a lot of great information about that. Setting the inventory boundaries and deciding on the methodology. The third and largest knowledge domain, the one that has the most questions, is identifying data needs and is managing data, which includes identifying the data needs and data sources, obtaining stakeholder involvement, collecting the data, determining your emissions factors, determining other parameters, and analyzing the data. The next area is calculating emissions, which includes executing the calculations as well as calculating the uncertainties. Synthesizing emissions inventory results includes organizing the calculated results and interpreting them, and then reporting activities, which includes generating the reports and managing the results of the dissemination. And then next, I'll say a little bit about recertification. You know, as mentioned before, with this field in particular, I think it's an evolving field where the knowledge and skills you need to have continues to evolve over time. And once you pass the exam, your accreditation is good for 5 years. It's a 5-year recertification cycle, and you have to complete certain activities in order to renew your credential after that 5-year period. And so there are 2 options. Once you're accredited to recertify, you can go through a combination of work experience and education, which would include completing 1 GPC compliant inventory. This one does have to be GBC compliant in this case, as well as completing 50 CE hours over that 5 years. And you can complete those continuing education or CE hours by taking and delivering courses through authorship if you have work that is published, as well as by volunteering if it's relevant to the GPC standard. And then the other option is to have that work experience completing the GPC compliant inventory and retaking the exam if you don't go through the education pathway. And all of this information is available in our candidate handbook, and I'm actually going to put the link into the chat, and then you guys will be able to look over that. That's where you can find all of our exam policies and all of the information, the link to the standard, which is the reference, as well as all of the knowledge domains that are covered. And so, you know, the reason to have this really rigorous credential is tied to the overall goal of the City Climate Planner program, which is to raise the global talent base of city climate planning professionals through training and certification. And we think that having a established, standardized group of practitioners involved in creating this fundamental data, which is so important for quality planning initiatives, is really important. And so that is all the information that I had about the credential. I hope you all found that interesting, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great, thank you, Nick and Cesar and Carly. That was really informative and comprehensive. So, folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the dialog box, and I'll read them aloud. I do have a few questions that have come in that I'll just read aloud to get us started. So, how many cities around the world use the GHG reporting protocol, and which ones in the U.S., if you know specifically?
Hello. Yes. Well, as I started, all of the cities which have committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, we need to showcase a GBC-based inventory within the first 2 years of their commitment. So at this point, we have a little bit over 9,000 cities, but due to the merging that the Global Covenant is, the Global Covenant is the result of a merger between the Compact of Mayors, which is a global initiative, which originally used the GBC, and the European Covenant of Mayors. So the European Covenant of Mayors brought around 7,000 cities, 8,000 cities, and the Compact of Mayors brought around 1,000 cities. So this group of 1,000 cities are supposed to deliver a GBC inventory within the first 2 years of their commitment, at least until the end of 2019. From the United States, I am aware that 5 cities, if I'm not mistaken, between 8 and 10 cities at this point have submitted and have obtained the badge of compliance for the GBC inventory, although other cities are in the stage of preparing it, collaborating with our colleagues from ICLEI USA. We have, from the United States, we have Boulder, which is one of the cities that come to mind. We have Fort Collins as well. And I do not remember the list from the top of my head, but of course you can find more information for these cities in the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy website. There is a list for all of the cities per region and per country.
Great, and a follow-up question on that is size of city. Does it matter if you're a small city? Do you have to be a large city? Is there a benefit to, larger cities versus smaller cities?
Well, at this point, it doesn't matter which size of city you are, which type of city you are, because the GBC can be cross-cutting throughout all of the size and different levels of government, states, provinces, countries, towns, Commonwealth, so forth and so on. You can apply the GBC to any size of city. And of course, each one has their different levels of advantages. For instance, a small city can identify if they have a little bit more of buffer to keep on developing, or if they can attract more investment to keep up the way of life, which is not very intensive in regards of GHG emissions. But for big cities, you can identify particularly which precise sector, subsector, scope, and type of gas you want to tackle with the policy development.
Great. Did you have more to say there? Okay, next question. How important is it to verify, is it necessary or important to verify GHG reporting using a third party?
Carly, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I can take this one. It's not required at all to verify using a third party. There are different options for verification, and again, these are outlined in the GPC itself, ways of conducting a verification, but it is an important aspect, but does not necessarily have to be a third party. Yeah, Cesar, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just to back up Carly's statement, of course, it's not 100% necessary, but if you belong to an international initiative that requires some sort of validation or data review from a third party, then of course you need to comply with whatever the initiative says. So, but in order to enhance transparency, it is recommended, but not mandatory.
Okay, great. Okay, that's actually all the questions that I have. If there's any last final information that you all want to give, actually, sorry, I do have just want to confirm with you all that you can, if people want further information, if it's okay to contact you directly, and that we post the presentation to our website.
Yeah, sure. No problem
Yeah.
on my side.
Yeah, I was going to just put this up. This is the contact form on the City Climate Planner website, and definitely we encourage you all to visit the website where you can join. We have a forum for practitioners to be able to network with each other and ask each other questions, and we have the contact form here which you can use, and we can distribute it to everybody else. But I'm certainly fine for anybody to contact me or any of the others here directly with any questions that you have.
Great, excellent. This is perfect. So folks, if you are interested in getting credentialed to do inventories for your municipality or encouraging your municipality to conduct one, I do want to encourage you to look into this as a tool. I think it's a really great way to reinforce the importance of doing inventory for your municipality or city. So great, thank you to all three of you for your presentation. Really, really wonderful. We will certainly post the recording on our website for others to view at another time. With that, stay tuned. We have not scheduled a next webinar, but we will likely have one in October for folks to participate in, and we will be sending out additional information on the topic. So thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.